Van Wankert. Winds it up, delivers. Tomey drills one high and deep to center. Away, way back. Gone deep into the picnic plaza, and that might have even got out of the ballpark. Jim Tomey has just left Jacobs Field onto Eagle Avenue. That will take 2 tape measures.
Hello again, everybody. Welcome back to Just a Bit Outside, our Cleveland Indians podcast here at Buckeye Scoop. I am your host, Brandon Castell, and I'm happy to be back with you here on a beautiful Tuesday in Cleveland, Ohio for episode 5 of Just a Bit Outside. Called this episode, Welcome to the Show, Kid. And we'll get into a little bit of that today and talk about the debut of one of the Cleveland Indians' young starting pitchers, another quality young starting pitcher that the Cleveland Indians have brought up through this farm system and who looks to be a future part of this rotation. But before we get into that, it was not a great weekend for the Cleveland Indians. After sweeping the Tigers the previous weekend in Detroit and then doing the same in Pittsburgh in a 3-game series with the Pirates during the middle of the week, the Indians went out and dropped 2 out of 3 over the weekend somehow against those same Detroit Tigers back here in Cleveland. Then they lost another heads-up battle with the Minnesota Twins on Monday night in a 3-2 game where their hitting failed to show up yet again. And that has been the story of this season. That has been the story of these battles between the Indians and the Twins. The Twins got home runs from Sano and Nelson Cruz, and that was enough for them to win the game 3-2, despite another quality outing from Aaron Civale on Monday. That goes to waste again as the Indians fall further behind the Minnesota Twins. They're now 2.5 games back in the American League Central, and they have just 2 players on the roster right now who are hitting .255 or above this season, and that's Franmil Reyes and Cesar Hernandez. Obviously, Franmil Reyes has turned it on as of late. He's hitting .282 with 6 home runs and 18 RBIs. And then you have Cesar Hernandez, who's hit a couple of home runs over the last few games. He's hitting .281, having a great start to the year, leading the team with 11 doubles, leading the team with 32 hits, leading the team, or second on the team, I guess, in runs with 17. But he's having a great start to the year, and that's pretty much it. You can count Tyler Naquin in there. He's had 36 at-bats since coming back from his foot injury early in the year. He's hitting .278 with 4 RBIs. Your next best hitter on the team is Francisco Lindor at .254. And then you've got Delino DeShields at .250, and then a huge drop-off down to Jose Ramirez at .230 on the season. So rough start to the year for the Indians hitters. That tends to be the case in Cleveland, but usually we blame it on the weather. Usually we blame it on snow, on ice, on rain in April and May. It has been an absolutely beautiful summer in Cleveland, Ohio. Plenty of sunshine, plenty of great weather, very little rain. As many people will notice when they look at their lawns, very little rain here in Cleveland, Ohio this summer. And so it has been the perfect summer for Cleveland Indians baseball, and it has not been the perfect summer for Cleveland Indians hitters. And so this is a major problem. We're going to talk a little bit more about that. Is there anything the Indians can do to get the bats turned around this season? Where could they go? Do we think there's enough hitting on this roster, or what might the Indians do to add another bat? This seems to be our perennial conversation at the trade deadline, which of course is coming in hot here at the end of this month. Seems like we just started the season, and we really did in many ways, but the trade deadline is coming in here quickly. So we'll talk a little bit about that today. We'll talk a little bit about the guys who are no longer on the major league roster right now, Zach Plesac, Mike Clevenger. We touched on that quite a bit in episode 4. So if you didn't get a chance to listen to episode 4 of the podcast, feel free to go back and download, listen to episode 4, leave a review, like the podcast. if you're enjoying it so far. You can also follow us on Twitter at JustOutsidePod, or you can follow myself on Twitter at BCastOhio. But one of the things we want to get into again is when will those guys rejoin the roster? And we talked a lot about that on last week's episode about the situation that went down. We'll talk a little bit about it today because it was another rough outing for Adam Plutko last weekend or over the weekend on Friday night against the Tigers. And so you're talking about a team that had really been dominated by the Cleveland Indians, and Adam Plutko on Friday night really turned the tide there, gave up 7 runs in 3 1/3 innings against the Detroit Tigers, and now holds a 6.88 ERA on the season. And so, in my opinion, every time Adam Plutko takes the mound, it becomes more and more painfully obvious that the Indians need Zach Plesac back. They need Mike Clevenger back on this roster. As much as they may not want to admit it, as much as some folks may want to continue this punishment and continue to have those guys potentially impact, their future in terms of their service time, this is a team that is not going to go anywhere without Zach Plesac and Mike Clevenger, at least one of those guys. And I've said that a couple times on this podcast, but this team's only going to go as far as the starting rotation can take it. And right now, with Adam Plutko in the rotation, they're not getting the same level of quality starting, quality pitching, night in and night out. It's putting a lot of stress on the bullpen, and you're really putting them in a position where they've got to put up runs that they're not really capable of putting up right now. Of course, Carlos Carrasco didn't do them any favors on Sunday. He didn't pitch great again, so he's been a little bit up and down to start the season, which is, understandable given everything he went through a year ago, but hasn't been helpful for this team when they've been dealing with the absence of guys like Zach Plesac and Mike Clevenger. And so he didn't pitch great on Sunday, and the Indians ended up losing the series over the weekend in Cleveland to a team they had beaten 20 straight times prior to that Friday night start by Adam Plutko. So the last win for the Tigers over the Indians prior to that game on Friday night had been April 10th of 2019. So this ended the longest winning streak by one team in Major League Baseball over another team since the Baltimore Orioles' 23-game winning streak over the Kansas City Royals back when they were an expansion team in 1969, 1970. The Tigers had also lost 9 straight games overall coming into that night. So really kind of turned the tide off the right arm of Adam Plutko there. And the Indians cannot seem to get their footing this season. The Minnesota Twins, on the other hand, went out and took 2 out of 3 from the Royals over the weekend. They extended their lead to 2.5 games over Cleveland with that win on Monday night. So obviously can put some really significant ground between themselves and the Indians with this series, these heads-up games. The Indians have not won against the Twins since that opening kind of series start by Shane Bieber, where he was unhittable up in Minnesota. They have not been able to hit the Minnesota Twins at all this season. And now they've got the Chicago White Sox right on their heels. In fact, the Chicago White Sox took 2 out of 3 against the Cubs over the weekend, and they are now tied with the Indians for second place in the American League Central at 17-12 overall. So the Indians are in a dogfight. We knew they would be. I've been telling you, if you've been listening to this podcast, that I was not counting out the Chicago White Sox. They've got too much young hitting. They've got some veterans who are really kind of getting up to speed and trying to find their roles on this team. And so I think you're going to be in a battle all season. And if the Indians don't figure out how to hit, they could end up sliding out of that 2 spot in the American League Central, end up being behind both the Twins and the White Sox. So they've got to figure this out. They've got a little bit of time to do it, but they've got to figure out how to start getting some wins at home. The Indians are 10-5 on the road this season, and they fell to 7-7 at home with that loss on Monday night to the Twins. So they've been a 500 ball club in Cleveland. Obviously, you don't have the same fan experience and overall kind of energy in the stadium that you might have, but that doesn't explain a whole lot when you think about what they've been able to do on the road versus what they've been able to do at home. And so the Indians are really looking for their identity and really trying to figure out how they can get this thing turned around from a hitting perspective in 2020. But it wasn't all bad over the weekend, thanks to the Saturday game and the Major League debut of Triston McKenzie. And so it started with a 1-2-3 inning and ended with a 10 strikeout performance. And I turned on the game on Saturday just to catch the third hitter that Triston McKenzie was facing, which of course was the great Miguel Cabrera. Obviously, he's a year or two here past his prime, but certainly one of the great hitters of our time, of our generation. And so what an incredible moment for Triston McKenzie. His first major league strikeout is against Miguel Cabrera. So obviously that's something this kid will remember for the rest of his life. The 23-year-old finally had a chance to show off his electric stuff that made him the number one ranked prospect in the Indian system heading into last season, according to Cleveland.com. Of course, he battled some injuries in both 2018 and last season. He missed the entire year due to lat and pectoral muscle strains. And so that's why if you look at the current list, or if you did look at the current list of top prospects for Cleveland heading into this season, you would have seen McKenzie's name at number 8 because of the injury history, because of the fact he wasn't able to do anything last season. He dropped from number 1 to number 8, but he certainly looked like the number 1 prospect in the Cleveland Indians system on Saturday, and that was great to see. He's 6'5". He looked like a 6'5" string bean version of Pedro Martinez out there. He very much has the same body type as the Pedro Martinez, except he's got about an 80-inch wingspan. And so he was really throwing some smoke with his fastball on Saturday. I think that was the most encouraging thing to see from him. He was putting the ball right where it needed to be in terms of location, and that's been his MO throughout his time in the minor leagues. And, he was able to really get some guys out with both his fastball and his off-speed stuff. And that's what it's going to take. You have a lot of these young kids that can come up throwing 95, 96 miles an hour, but if they can't find that location, if they can't get guys out with their off-speed pitches, then, it's going to be tough for those guys to stick in the major leagues. McKenzie had 17 swings and misses on the day out of his 80 pitches, so only threw 80 pitches in his debut, struck out 10 guys. His fastball was averaging right around the mid-90s, which is where you want to see with Triston McKenzie. The one knock on him has been, if that fastball slips into the low 90s, obviously we know that's a significant difference between the impact you can have in Major League Baseball. Topped out at above 96, so 96.5 miles per hour on the day. So obviously this kid was pumped up. This kid was throwing some smoke out there, and he actually became the first pitcher with 10 or more strikeouts in his Major League debut since Freddie Peralta back in 2018. He struck out 13 batters in his debut with the Milwaukee Brewers. So this was an exciting moment for the Indians. This was an exciting moment for McKenzie. It was also the second most strikeouts by a Cleveland Indians pitcher in their Major League debut ever, trailing only Louis Tiant, who struck out 11 back in his Major League debut in 1964. So it's been quite a while since a Cleveland Indians pitcher hit double-digit strikeouts in his Major League debut. And obviously they've had some incredible pitching prospects come up through the system, some incredible talent make their kind of Major League debut with the Indians over the last 60 years. And Triston McKenzie did something that none of those other guys have done, which is strike out 10 batters in his Major League debut. Really shouldn't come as a shock to you if you had a chance to look at his minor league numbers back in 2017 before the injuries. He actually struck out 186 batters in 143 innings down in Lynchburg. So this is a kid who has the ability to get guys out with the strikeout. This is a kid that has some serious talent and starting to finally be able to show that now that he's been healthy for 2020. He made only 16 starts in 2018 because of injury. He missed, as I mentioned, all of last season because of those arm injuries. And so now he finally looked healthy on Saturday. Again, more impressive, I would say, than just the velocity, which was, of course, important, was the accuracy and the location. If he can keep that velocity in the mid-90s and he can pitch and locate the ball the way he did on Saturday, the Indians may be looking at another young stud to add to this rotation, another guy who can be a front end of the rotation type pitcher. And so we'll see what happens here with McKenzie moving forward. Chris Antonetti already came out and said that they're not going to option him back to Lake County just yet. He's going to stay with the big league club. He's going to make at least one more start. And again, a lot of this will depend on what happens with Zach Plesac, what happens with Mike Clevenger. But we know that this kid has some serious talent, and I'm excited to see what he's going to do moving forward and what he's going to be capable of, and if he can establish himself as a rotational guy. And that could allow the Indians to do some things, to maybe trade an arm, to trade a starting pitcher for a bat, which they desperately need. And we'll talk about that a little bit on this week's episode. Okay, moving into the next topic here. Another big headline over the weekend was around Oliver Perez. So obviously we've talked at length last week's episode and even already this week a little bit about the situation with Zach Plesac, with Mike Clevenger violating the COVID protocols, essentially being sent home for Zach Plesac in a car service from Chicago to Cleveland when they were up there for a weekend road trip. And kind of the new headline that came out was that, again, the Indians had to make a tough decision. Were they going to keep these guys on the major league roster, essentially give them a slap on the wrist, or were they going to actually have some type of serious punishment, some type of serious response to these guys breaking protocol, coming back after curfew, leaving the team hotel? And so if you missed it, there was a recent ESPN article put out by Jeff Passan, and he says in the article that not only did the Indians make that decision just based on the overall response from the team, but there was actually one player on the roster who threatened to opt out for the rest of the 2020 season if they allowed those guys to remain on the roster, at least for the immediate future. And so it was actually buried. The headline didn't give away who that individual was, but if you had a chance to read the article, inside the article, you would find out that that player was left-hander Oliver Perez. And so Oliver Perez threatened to opt out for the rest of the season if they kept those guys on the roster. And so, this was a serious situation. Again, the article said he wasn't the only one that was, basically had this same mentality about the situation. There were other guys on the team that were not happy. There were other guys on the team that apparently had similar feelings, but Oliver Perez was the guy who put himself out there and really let the team know, the front office know, that he was not going to pitch for the Indians this season if they decided to keep those two guys on the roster. Of course, the front office ultimately decided to send Plesac and Clevenger to the minor league alternate site in Lake County to make an example of these guys. And, this could have some pretty serious repercussions. So this is not just, hey, we're going to send you down, you're going to miss one start, and we're going to bring you back up. Obviously, we talked a little bit about the fact that you've got Adam Plutko now, who's made 3 starts for the Indians. All of them have been terrible, and it has really hurt the team to have him in the starting rotation. He's a guy that should be, a long reliever out of the bullpen, a guy who can give you some good innings. If one of your starters, something happens, they aren't able to give you the usual outing. That's where I think Adam Plutko can really be, a guy who has value on this roster. But he has certainly shown that he's not a guy, at least to this point, who can be a mainstay in the rotation. And so this doesn't appear to be something, though, where they're just going to send them down for a quick slap on the wrist, bring them back, and all will be forgiven and forgotten. Now, if the Indians keep Mike Clevenger in the minor leagues for 20 or more days this season, this could dramatically impact his service time, ultimately delay his free agency by a full year. So this could be a serious punishment, a serious ramification for Clevenger, and the same with Plesac. According to Clevenger, or according to the article by Passan, Clevenger entered the season with 3 years, 41 days of service, and Plesac entered the season with 125 days. Obviously, 2019 was Plesac's first year in the major leagues. But again, if Clevenger remains on the option, if he remains at Lake County for 20 days, the maximum number of roster days he can get this season is 47, which under the formula that they're using would equal 130 days of service. That would leave him at 3 years, 171 days, or 1 day short of reaching his full 4 years of service. And again, that's in the article by Jeff Passan. He outlines this in the article, but again, you're talking about a potentially significant impact. Again, if it's 20 plus days, that means essentially there's no way for Mike Clevenger to get to that 4th year of service, which means it would essentially push everything back in his timeline in terms of arbitration, in terms of free agency. Everything would be pushed back by a year, which of course could end up being a good thing for the Indians, obviously, if they plan to keep Mike Clevenger long term. And the same could be said with Zach Plesac. Again, if he spends 20 plus days in this minor league setting for 2020, he could see his arbitration eligibility delayed until 2022. And then, of course, ultimately that could delay his free agency beyond that. And so these are some of the potential ramifications. Now, what are the Indians thinking? Are they planning along these lines? I'm sure these discussions are going on internally. Do we feel like this is enough punishment for them if they just bring them back up now? Or is there a feeling within the organization that this is a serious enough offense that they're going to potentially impact the future for these guys? And so obviously I think if there's a way to do this where this is the type of punishment that they feel like they deserve, and then they're able to actually benefit from this as a team, because now they have obviously they have an additional year of eligibility, additional year of these guys on the roster, then I think that could end up working out well for them. Do these guys deserve it is the real question. Do they deserve to potentially not only miss part of this season, but have their arbitration delayed, have their free agency delayed, and potentially impact their careers over, leaving the hotel and coming back after curfew, potentially? I mean, I think that would certainly send a message to the rest of the team and really the rest of Major League Baseball, I think, as this story potentially is picked up around the league, that, if you're going to violate these protocols that could potentially put the season in jeopardy, or at least a portion of the season in jeopardy, that there's going to be some serious ramifications. And it's not just going to be a slap on the wrist. It's not just going to be a game or two that you will miss. It's potentially going to impact free agency, arbitration, potentially going to impact a number of things that obviously these guys are focused on for the rest of their careers. So we'll see what happens there. We'll see if the Indians decide to go that full length of potentially impacting the future. But obviously it's something that is on the docket right now. It's potentially something that they may decide to do. And so the real question here will be, how do those guys handle it? How does the rest of the team handle it if they decide not to go that route when they bring these guys back? With a guy like Oliver Perez, is there going to be a moment of kind of that come to Jesus moment between, Oliver Perez and these young guys? I say young guys, Mike Clevenger, 29, Zach Plesac, 25, but certainly we know that guys have done a lot worse things than what happened in this instance, but it could have potentially ended a lot worse, especially for Mike Clevenger getting on the team plane. And again, if you want to hear more about my thoughts around that, you can listen to episode 4, last week's episode around Mike Clevenger and Zach Plesac. But him getting on the plane potentially put folks in danger, could have endangered Carlos Carrasco's life, but also more likely could have endangered just, the potential for folks on the team to test positive or things like that. Now, Clevenger and Plesac have said, they never put themselves in any danger. They weren't out at a club. They weren't in a situation where they were not following CDC protocols. They were, with a small group of folks. They were, never with more than 8 people. And so maybe in their mind, they never actually put anyone in jeopardy, but obviously there's no way to know that unless they videotape their entire night. And I highly doubt that. We'll never know for sure exactly what took place, when those guys were out and about in Chicago. But obviously Oliver Perez, being an elder statesman on the team, being a guy who's 38 years old and a guy who's at the very tail end of his career, felt like it was serious enough that he was potentially willing to opt out for the rest of the season. Now, I want to take that into our next section here on the program, which is our Tribe Throwback section. And so I thought it would be interesting to talk about Oliver Perez a little bit because, again, not a lot of people have probably followed Oliver Perez's career other than maybe when he did sign a big contract with the New York Mets a number of years ago. And so I'm not sure a lot of people really realize this is the same Oliver Perez who was a starting pitcher for the San Diego Padres, eventually for the Pittsburgh Pirates, and of course the New York Mets. And so thought it was interesting as I started to research Oliver Perez, kind of his ties back to the Cleveland Indians. And we've talked about the trade for Grady Sizemore in the past on this show and Cliff Lee. But this is one of those trades that actually went the opposite direction involving Oliver Perez back in the day. And so this is one of those things where, again, he wasn't directly involved in a Cleveland Indians trade, but he was somewhat involved in an interesting trade that I would say is one of the worst that the Indians have ever made. It's certainly one of the worst of my lifetime or of recent Cleveland Indians history, which is when the Indians traded Brian Giles. And so we'll start back at the beginning. Oliver Perez actually signed with the San Diego Padres in 1999. So think about that. That is a long time ago, 21 years ago. Oliver Perez signed with the San Diego Padres. There can't be a lot of guys in Major League Baseball who signed with the team in the 90s and are still pitching here in 2020. So give Oliver Perez credit. Also give him credit for being a left-handed pitcher, because those are the guys that typically have a chance to stay in the league at this type of length, this many years. And so Oliver Perez originally started his career with the Padres, and he was part of their trade for Brian Giles, who was the former Cleveland Indian, 4 years later in 2003. Now, obviously, that wasn't a direct trade with the Indians, but the Padres sent Perez and someone you should know, an outfielder named Jason Bay, to Pittsburgh for Brian Giles, who had been traded by the Indians to the Pirates in 1998 for Ricardo Rincon. That's a name that I hadn't heard in quite a while. Obviously, one Cleveland Indians fans are familiar with if you followed the Indians in the 90s, and especially as they were transitioning from a powerhouse juggernaut team in kind of the mid to late 90s into the 2000s team that essentially disbanded what was the greatest Indians team, at least in terms of stretch and talent, probably in Indians history. And so the Indians traded Brian Giles in 1998 for Ricardo Rincon, and Rincon was an absolute disaster for the Indians in 1999. He went 2-3 with a 4.43 ERA in 59 games in the 1999 season. However, he did pitch really well for the Indians out of the bullpen the next 2 years. So in 2000, he had a 2.70 ERA, and in 2001, he had a 2.83 ERA out of the bullpen for the Indians. So it wasn't a complete waste of a trade. They did get a nice pitcher out of the bullpen, at least in the year 2000, 2001. Unfortunately, for the Indians, Brian Giles was far more impactful for the Pittsburgh Pirates over those 3 years and over the rest of his career. After the trade to Pittsburgh, which, again, I think has to go down as one of the worst trades in modern or recent Cleveland Indians history, Giles would go on to hit 30-plus home runs in each of the next 4 seasons. So you're talking about a time when the team is transitioning away from the Albert Bells, the Manny Ramirez, the Kenny Lofton era of Cleveland Indians baseball. They've got a young outfielder. They've got a talented power-hitting outfielder in Brian Giles. And in this kind of desperate search to stay in the game and to find pitching, which they could not do in the 90s, and of course now we're in the opposite position. They've got tons of pitching and they can't find any hitting. In order to kind of stay in the game and find some relief pitching, they traded one of the better young outfielders in baseball, again, in that trade to the Pittsburgh Pirates. And Giles would go on in 1999 and hit .315 with 39 home runs and 115 RBIs in his first season with the Pirates. So he had been kind of a platoon player with the Indians, part-time player for the Indians. Obviously, that anyone who watched Brian Giles as a young player in Cleveland knew that he had some talent. I'm not sure everybody, and certainly the Indians front office, John Hart and the team at the time, would not have necessarily known that Brian Giles was going to go out and hit .315 with 39 home runs and 115 RBIs in 1999. But then he comes back again in 2000. He hits .315 again with 35 home runs and 123 RBIs for the Pirates in 2000. And then in 2001, he continues that. He hits .309 with 37 home runs and 95 RBIs. And then the following season, 2002, he hits 38 home runs. So you're talking about monster power numbers. Now, yes, this is maybe potentially the era of steroids or some other things that might have been going on back then, but still some monster power numbers from Brian Giles after the trade to Pittsburgh, 39, 35, 37, and 38 home runs in the 4 seasons after they traded him to Pittsburgh. And then the Pirates turned around and traded Brian Giles to the Padres for Oliver Perez and Jason Bay. And that ended up being a great trade for the Pirates. So Jason Bay comes over as a younger version of Brian Giles, ends up being a very similar player. He goes on to hit 32 home runs in 2005 with Pittsburgh and then 35 home runs in 2006. So obviously the Pirates made a good move there to, parlay Ricardo Rincon into Jason Bay and Oliver Perez. Perez would go on to have one good season with Pittsburgh in 2004. He went 12-10 with a 2.98 ERA in 30 starts. So again, this is back when he was a starting pitcher. And so he was, again, 12-10, not a great record. Pittsburgh wasn't a great team, obviously at that point, but a 2.98 ERA. The next season, his ERA ballooned up to 5.85, and it was over 6 the following year in 2006. And then he ends up on the New York Mets, and he signs a big deal with the New York Mets, and then he was completely terrible during his entire career in New York, posted an ERA of 6.80 in back-to-back seasons before he ended up in Seattle. And that's when the Mariners turned him into a relief pitcher. So the idea that Oliver Perez could continue to be a starter was over. And again, had that been kind of his goal or the only kind of thing that he was open to, that likely would have been the end of his career. But instead, Seattle turns Oliver Perez into a left-handed reliever, and there simply aren't enough of those to go around. Obviously, the Indians feel the same way. They're still using him as a left-handed reliever at age 38. They don't have any other left-handers in their bullpen right now other than Brad Hand, their closer. So very difficult to find talented left-handed pitching. And so the Mariners turned him into a reliever. He went on to pitch with Arizona, Houston, and Washington. He was briefly with the Reds and Yankees, but never made it to their big league team. And so this guy has bounced around and been around the league for, again, 2 decades and a number of teams, and really looked like he was headed to retirement at that point because he didn't catch on with the Reds. He didn't catch on with the Yankees. And then he signs a contract with the Indians in 2018, and suddenly he's reborn. Oliver Perez as essentially a kind of specialist out of the bullpen, left-handed specialist, is reborn in 2018 when he joins the Cleveland Indians. He would post a 1.39 ERA in 51 games in his first season in Cleveland. Last season, he had a 3.9 ERA in 40 innings, so wasn't a great kind of season for him, but not as terrible, not as bad as he has been in the previous years. And then this season, he is off to a hot start out of the bullpen. He has a .93 ERA in 11 appearances, and he's the only, as I mentioned, the only left-hander in the bullpen other than Brad Hand. And so this is a guy that, again, has been around forever. He is in his 18th major league season, so that is actually significant. That makes Oliver Perez the longest tenured Mexican player in the history of Major League Baseball. And so if you're like me, you probably didn't know the full backstory on Oliver Perez, how he became part of the Cleveland Indians organization, how he's still pitching in the league at age 38 in his 18th season. So very, very impressive for a guy to still be doing that. That said, I'm not sure I would make any meaningful decisions about my franchise or the future of my franchise based on a 38-year-old relief pitcher. Again, you've got to start to think about, some of these young guys, the impact that this could have on the locker room. But clearly the Indians needed some leadership in that locker room. There are a lot of young guys on this team. The best players on the team are 25 and 26 in Shane Bieber and Francisco Lindor. And so, again, when you lose a guy like Corey Kluber, again, who was more of a do what I do, not what I say kind of guy. But when you lose a guy like that, you have to think that Terry Francona, Carl Willis are relying on Perez, who's a guy who's been around the league, who's got some longevity, who's a veteran, who's an adult. You're relying on him for some leadership, especially in this type of a situation where, again, we talked about it on last week's episode. The makeup of that locker room, the brotherhood in that locker room is so important that you've got to find a way to handle this very delicately. What can you do to keep that team together? And so I'm sure they relied on Oliver Perez for some leadership. He obviously made sure or felt comfortable sharing with them what he felt like needed to kind of take place and that he did not want those guys returning to the team immediately. The sense I got from the article is that he didn't want them coming back to Chicago and rejoining the team in Chicago or rejoining the team immediately on their next road trip. And so I'm not sure that he was saying if they returned to the team at any point that he would consider opting out, but obviously he felt strongly about it at the time. And so now you've got some talk about the Indians potentially moving on from these two guys, or one of these two guys, Zach Plesac and Mike Clevenger. And so let's talk about, and let's start with Zach Plesac, because that one is not happening. In my mind, there's a 0.0% chance the Indians are even discussing the idea of trading Plesac, let alone actually doing it. Obviously, that anything could happen if they're going to go out and get a kind of top tier player. Maybe that would be the only case where I could see them even considering trading Zach Plesac, even in light of this situation. Again, he was the one that ended up taking the car service home, kind of did the right thing, at least at that point. And the bigger thing here is, again, this is the Cleveland Indians. This is a team that has to make smart financial decisions about talent and where to get talent and how to keep talent. And Zach Plesac is simply too young and too talented and under control for too long for the Cleveland Indians to really consider any type of a trade involving Zach Plesac. He's 25 years old. He's under the Indians' control through the 2025 season. And so they have control over him for the next 2 years, followed by 3 years potentially of arbitration. He'll become a free agent in 2026 at the age of 31. And that's assuming that nothing happens to change that in terms of his service time. And that could, again, if he ends up staying in this minor league setting for 20 or more days, that could have an impact on when he becomes eligible for arbitration, and then certainly could push that free agency year back to 2027. So there is just too much time left with Zach Plesac under the Indians' control. And, I just can't see them, thinking about a deal that would involve Zach Plesac. And I think they know they're going to need him sooner than later. This is a guy who was pitching really, really well to start the season. Again, if you put him out there with Shane Bieber, Aaron Savale, and hopefully Carlos Carrasco kind of turning the ship around, you've got 4 front-end starters, at least the way they started this season. And then I think the bigger question mark is Mike Clevenger and whether the Indians would consider trading Clevenger for the right deal. In my mind, that deal would have to include an outfield bat, at least one outfield bat. I think that's obviously what everyone would say at this point. That is clearly the weakest area of the team for this Cleveland Indians lineup, and they've got to address that in some way at this season. I just don't see any way around it. Even with Tyler Naquin back and hitting 278 in his first few games back, I just can't imagine that that they're going to feel comfortable about their outfield situation. Oscar Mercado was sent to the minor leagues. Bradley Zimmer was sent to the minor leagues. Greg Allen looked like he was about to be sent to the minor leagues before he had a big weekend. And so I just can't imagine that the Indians feel good about Domingo Santana hitting 169 right now as your everyday right fielder. Jordan Luplow's hitting 139 as one of your platoon guys in left field. And, you don't really have a lot of options there. So at some point they're going to have to make a change. And so I think Clevenger is the guy. If they're going to trade a starting pitcher, I would think Clevenger is the guy who's going to make the most sense. He's 29 years old and will be an unrestricted free agent in 2023. He did agree to a new $4.1 million contract with the Indians for 2020 to avoid arbitration. So showed some good faith there in working with the Indians rather than going through the arbitration process. But he has 2 more years of arbitration eligibility left before he becomes an unrestricted free agent at the age of 32. Now, again, the Indians could potentially impact that if they keep him in the minor leagues or keep him at Lake County long enough. That would push back that free agency, essentially until 2024 when he's 33 years old. So we'll see what happens with that. But other than that scenario, the Indians have 2 more seasons with Mike Clevenger, and it could take arbitration. They could end up in a situation like they did with Trevor Bauer, who won his arbitration case last offseason with the Indians and ended up earning $13 million for the 2019 season as a result. Of course, Trevor Bauer is a character. Trevor Bauer is a guy who wears his emotions on his sleeve, and he pretty much let everybody know he wasn't happy about having to go through that arbitration. And so the Indians end up trading him to the Cincinnati Reds in the deal that brought back Brandon Reyes. And Trevor Bauer ended up agreeing with the Cincinnati Reds that they would pay him $17.5 million for 2020 so that he didn't have to go through another arbitration case. So Trevor Bauer kind of went through the same process that the Indians may be facing with Mike Clevenger in a few years. Bauer will now be an unrestricted free agent after this season. And the way he's pitching this year, and he has been completely dominant for the Cincinnati Reds. The way he's pitching this year, he could be one of the highest paid free agents in all of baseball next season. And so, I don't think Mike Clevinger is on that same path. Again, I continue to think that Mike Clevinger has some of the better stuff on this rotation, hasn't really put it all together. And maybe that's a mental makeup. Maybe that's just some of the injuries and things he's battled with. But the Indians could certainly avoid any of that type of situation with Clevinger if they decide to trade him this season before the deadline. And they happen to be one of the few teams in Major League Baseball that could make this happen without really having a tremendous impact on the team. Now, obviously, I think Mike Clevinger is going to be a better option for them moving forward as a fifth starter than Triston McKenzie or some of these other guys that might be in the rotation for 2020. But the Indians have enough starting pitching to make it work, especially if this McKenzie kid is as good as he looked on Saturday. And so one deal that was floated by MLB.com, John Morosi, over the weekend was sending Clevinger to Boston for one of their young outfielders. I detailed on last week's episode why the trade for JD Martinez wouldn't make much sense for the Indians. So if you're interested in hearing about that, again, please feel free to download, listen to episode 4, which is called Ain't No Sunshine. We talked a little bit about JD Martinez, his current contract, the fact that he has opt-out clauses after these seasons, and just the overall price tag and age and ability to play the outfield for JD Martinez, in my opinion, doesn't make sense for the Indians. But Morosi suggests the Red Sox are so desperate for pitching right now that they might be willing to trade one of their young outfielders, and he specifically mentions Alex Verdugo, who was one of the key young players that they got in the Mookie Betts trade with the Dodgers. So if you aren't aware of that trade, and I would assume by now everyone is, on February 10th of this year, the Dodgers traded Verdugo, Jeter Downs, who probably is the focal point of that trade at this point, and Connor Wong to the Red Sox in exchange for Mookie Betts, David Price, and cash consideration. So massive trade, obviously involving one of the best players in baseball, Mookie Betts, who may right now be the best player in baseball, which we talked about on a previous episode as well. And so Verdugo was one of the key guys in that trade. But, this is a situation where, again, the Red Sox are scuffling. They're no longer in the mix this year, and they desperately need pitching. Now, I don't know that Mike Clevinger would be the guy that they would go out and target, but Mass Live actually did an article on the potential of this trade over the last week, and their conclusion was probably similar to what I would conclude, that it's unlikely the Red Sox would be willing to even consider a trade for Verdugo unless for some reason they were confident in committing long-term to Andrew Benintendi, and they were interested in promoting their kind of top young outfield prospect, Jarren Duran, to the major leagues in 2021. And so again, that's one of those situations where they've got some good young talent. Duran is currently rated as the number 8 prospect in the Red Sox system by MLB.com, but it's just hard for me to imagine a team as savvy as Boston being open to trading a guy like Verdugo for a 29-year-old pitcher, even if they think that he's got some of the best stuff in the American League, even if they think they can turn him into, a front end of the rotation type of guy. Verdugo is only 24 years old. He was the top-ranked prospect in the Dodgers system last year, according to MLB.com, before he was called up midseason. And he entered Sunday hitting .298 with 5 home runs and 11 RBIs and has taken over the leadoff spot in Boston's lineup. Now, it's not a very good Boston team right now, so you're probably going to see more and more of these young guys getting a chance to play. But unless the Indians are interested in parting ways with Plesac, I just can't see them having any real shot to land Verdugo from the Red Sox. And that's one of those weird situations where maybe a Plesac for a Verdugo trade makes sense. I wouldn't do it if I was the Cleveland Indians. I think you can find hitting somewhere else, but maybe they like this kid enough that they felt like they could part with a guy like Plesac in order to make a trade for an elite young outfield talent. A more comparable trade might actually be a one-for-one type swap of Clevinger for Andrew Benintendi, or maybe Andrew Benintendi and, something additional, a few prospects. Obviously, that's a guy who has had some promise or shown some promise during his career in the major leagues. He's a Cincinnati native, former National High School Player of the Year, former Ohio Gatorade Baseball Player of the Year. And he was the 7th overall pick in 2015 by the Boston Red Sox after playing at the University of Arkansas. He's a left-handed hitting outfielder and 26 years old, and he's under team control for 2021 at a very affordable $6.6 million. He is arbitration eligible in 2022 and will become an unrestricted free agent in 2023, the same year as Clevenger. So again, I don't know that it makes sense for the Indians. They're probably not going to want to commit a long-term contract to Andrew Benintendi, but he has had a rough start to the season, and maybe he can be had on the cheap. Maybe they could get some other prospects and really build a package around Andrew Benintendi and in a trade for Mike Clevenger. Obviously, no matter what, I think he would be a significant upgrade over what the Indians are doing right now in left field. The Indians started again Jordan Luplow there on Sunday. He's hitting 139 on the season. He has 5 hits, 1 home run, and 1 double on the year, slugging .250 as your left fielder. And then in right field, of course, you've got Domingo Santana, who's hitting $169, slugging .308. And so this is not going to get it done for the Cleveland Indians, probably a big reason why they've struggled against the Twins. They've struggled in some of these other games. And corner outfield has been a major issue for Cleveland for a number of years. And so while I think Benintendi would be an upgrade, I'm not sure if it's enough of an upgrade to part with someone as good as Clevenger, even given the circumstances. That just doesn't give you enough additional time of control over that player. And so I just can't imagine it at this point. His best MLB season came in 2018 when he hit .290 with 16 home runs, 41 doubles, 87 RBI, and 21 steals. So he is kind of a 5-tool player, jack-of-all-trades type player, but he's been trending in the wrong direction. Benintendi's strikeout rate went through the roof last season. He struck out 140 times in 541 at-bats. His average dropped to .266, and as of Sunday, he was hitting just a .103 to start the 2020 season. He went on the disabled list back on August 12th with a rib cage strain. So who knows if he's even someone the Indians would be interested in given that situation coming up on the August 31st trade deadline. I personally wouldn't be interested in that type of trade, and I wouldn't be selling Clevenger on the cheap based on one incident of immaturity. Now, I do think that it's okay for them to entertain the potential for trading Clevenger. I just don't think a guy like Andrew Benintendi is getting enough back for someone with as much arm talent as Clevenger. Okay, for our last topic of the week here on episode 5 of Just a Bit Outside, our Cleveland Indians podcast here at Buckeye Scoop, wanted to talk about a few other potential deals for Mike Clevenger. So since it seems like he is potentially the most likely of the players, the key players for the Indians who could be moved before the August 31st deadline, based on his age, based on everything we just walked through around his contract, and obviously based on the most recent situation. Again, I do not think the Indians should move Clevenger if they are going to have to move him on the cheap. If they are not going to get something valuable in return, I do not think that this incident is enough to warrant such an extreme move. I do not think that it's something that will linger long term. I think that Clevenger will be able to apologize to the other folks on the team and have a reconciliation, come back into the fold here in Cleveland. And again, I think he has some really good stuff that he can still put it together if he can stay healthy. But if the Indians are desperate to improve their ball club here in 2020, then obviously they need to consider making a move for an outfield bat. And we just talked about the reason for that. Their corner outfield spots, really all their outfield spots are in a complete state of flux and have been for a number of years. A lot of the young guys that they brought up through the system, the Bradley Zimmers, the Oscar Mercados, the Greg Allens, these guys have really not panned out. And so now they have, Domingo Santana playing right field. You've got a platoon in left, and really they're just lacking any type of pop. They're lacking any type of impact from the outfield. They're putting way too much of the responsibility on the infield, on Lindor and Jose Ramirez and Carlos Santana. And I just think they need to make a move at some point. I still think it'll probably be a lower level move. But if they were to trade Mike Clevenger, the two teams that I would have at the top of my list are probably not the Boston Red Sox, but their biggest rival, the New York Yankees. Now, that pains me to say that, but I would have the Yankees at the top of my list, along with potentially the Atlanta Braves. And I feel like the Atlanta Braves are in the perfect position to be a trade partner with the Indians. They've got a tremendous amount of young talent that they've been developing there, and guys that they've drafted high and who are close to being major league ready. They're also in a position where their roster is good, it's young, it's ready to play and compete and win now. And so they could really benefit from having a guy like Mike Clevinger at the front end of their rotation. And so I would look at the Yankees and the Atlanta Braves as the top two teams to potentially partner with in a trade for Mike Clevinger. Again, I never liked trading with the New York Yankees. It would be tough to watch Clevinger in pinstripes and potentially have to cut his hair. The whole thing would be very odd. But I think that the Indians are in a position where they could make a move like this and really potentially impact the overall team structure for the long term if they get the right parts, if they get the right deal back from the Yankees. And so one of the key connection points here that makes sense is that the new pitching coach in New York, Matt Blake, knows Clevinger just about as well as anyone in baseball. He was Cleveland's director of pitching before the New York Yankees hired him away from Cleveland during the offseason. Francona has mentioned a few times in the past how Blake had a lot of impact in working with guys like Zach Plesac and Aaron Savale on their way to the big leagues. And maybe the Indians can use that connection to their benefit if he is a big fan of Clevinger and believes that Clevinger could be, a front-end rotational guy for them, a middle-of-the-rotation guy, I guess, even in New York, would really give them the pieces to be the clear front-runner to win the World Series. Obviously, you never want to make the Yankees stronger while weakening your own roster, but right now I just don't see the Indians being able to compete with the Yankees. When you think about their firepower, you think about the roster that they've got in place, the bullpen they've got, obviously the money that they're able to spend, going to make it pretty difficult for the Indians to compete at that level. And so, I think the Indians need to focus on themselves, focus on their team. How do you beat the Twins and the White Sox for the AL Central? How do you get into the playoffs? Hope you can catch some magic, but more importantly, continue to build for the future. And again, this is a team that is only, 3-4 years removed from the World Series now. Obviously, a lot of turnover on this roster, and we don't know where things are headed in the future. But I think giving yourself roster flexibility could potentially be a good move. And so for me to even consider a trade of Clevinger to the dark side, I would really need the deal to include Miguel Andujar. And, to be honest, I want Clint Frazier back just because I feel like it. So to me, that's really where I think a trade could potentially make sense. The name Miguel Andujar should sound familiar. He hit 27 home runs and 47 doubles with the Yankees as a rookie in 2018, but he has only had 68 at-bats since then. He's battled a torn labrum in his shoulder. He decided not to have surgery. That ended up potentially, having a longer-term effect than people had expected, and he just hasn't been able to get back into the lineup ever since the injury. A lot of that is due to the fact the Indians gifted the Yankees Gio Urshela, who is their everyday starting third baseman. Remember, Giovanni Urshela was the Indians' third baseman for a while, dating back to those World Series teams, but he has become a much better hitter in New York than he ever looked like he would in Cleveland. And so they're set when you think about Gio Urshela being their third baseman. You think about Gleyber Torres at short, DJ LeMahieu at second. They're pretty much set in their infield. And so that's why they ended up moving Andujar to left field. But he has not had much impact on this season. He was just 2 for his first 21 to start the year. And he's really not seeing much playing time with the Yankees. And I wouldn't expect him to see much, moving forward when you think about their goals and their roster. And they'll probably end up adding someone else into the mix at some point. And so I wouldn't expect that he's going to get a lot more playing time. And then Clint Frazier, kind of in the same position. He has just 27 at-bats this season. He's hitting .333, but really not seen action, in a lot of games, and has really only seen action in one full season since the Yankees traded him to New York back in 2016 in the Andrew Miller trade. Now, obviously, that trade worked out very, very well for the Indians. Andrew Miller was probably the team's MVP in their 2016 run to the World Series, but obviously now would be a great time to have Clint Frazier back on your roster. He's still only 25 years old. He's not going to become an unrestricted free agent until 2025 at the age of 30. And he is slated for 4 years of arbitration, but I think that's the kind of situation the Indians ownership would certainly be willing to take on. I don't anticipate him going into many of those arbitration situations unless he turns it on and all of a sudden becomes Brian Giles or someone like that and has that type of trajectory. So if the Indians could find a way to somehow get Andahar and Frazier or some type of package centered around at least one of those guys, I think you got to get almost two of those guys or at least one and a handful of prospects to make this work, because I'm not 100% certain that either of those guys is, the answer or the long-term solution. I think between the two of them, you probably are going to find one guy who certainly can become your everyday left fielder. And so, I would want to get at least one of those guys in the trade if I was going to pull the trigger for Mike Clevenger. Again, no rush for the Indians to have to make this deal. The Yankees are in a little bit more of a time crunch in wanting to put together, the ultimate roster to win the World Series. So that would be kind of my key landing spot for Mike Clevenger, as unfortunate as that is. And then the other spot, we talked a little bit about this previously, about the Braves and the fact that they are loaded with young outfield talent, but they really do need pitching. And this is in the situation where the Indians could potentially be the benefactor of that. And I don't know that you're going to be able to pull Christian Pache from them. I just don't think that they're going to give up a guy who is the 13th ranked prospect in all of baseball for a Mike Clevenger who's 29. But, I think you could start there. And if you could put together a package, maybe potentially you could get your hands on Pache. If not, they've got another kid, Drew Waters, who's really high on their list and who's a really good outfield prospect with the Braves. He's a kid who's 21. He's a switch hitter. He can play pretty much anywhere in the outfield. He has enough speed to play center field, but probably best suited for one of the corner outfield spots at the next level. So, again, that's not going to be an immediate fix for the Indians. So there are some other things at play there. They would probably still need to go out and get another outfielder. So not sure that makes sense if they're committed to trying to contend for this season. Again, obviously they're in the mix, and this is one of those years where, you're probably going to make the playoffs. So I wouldn't imagine that they would not want to at least make a shot or take a shot at, contending and potentially making an impact in the playoffs this season. So I don't know if this is the kind of deal that they would want to make for Clevenger, but certainly you might be able to get a kid who in a year or two is up in your major leagues and playing every day in the outfield, because they have not, for all their credit, in developing pitching and starting pitching, they have not been able to develop these outfielders, at least guys who are able to stick in the major leagues. So definitely something to consider here as we get closer and closer to the trade deadline. We are only days away here from the trade deadline here on August 31st. We'll see if the Indians decide to make a move. I don't think that they will trade either Zach Plesac or Mike Clevenger, again, unless the right deal comes up. I think you will see them make a smaller move. They've got to get an outfield bat. I'm not sure what that looks like or what they'd be willing to give up, but I do think they've got to make a move there. The hitting is just so bad right now that they've really got to do something to jumpstart this team, especially if they are going to bring back Plesac and Clevenger. Now your rotation is back to being one of the best in baseball, and you've got a significant chance to potentially compete if you can get enough hitting on a nightly basis. And so we'll see what happens there, but appreciate you joining us here for episode 5 of our podcast. Again, you can follow the Just a Bit Outside podcast on Twitter at Just Outside Pod. You can follow myself, Brandon Castell, your host, at BCastOhio. Of course, you can follow Buckeye Scoop and the Scoop Pods Network on Twitter as well. We look forward to talking with you again next week.